Ever complain about your living conditions? Well, buckle up, because medieval prisoners had such terrible accommodations that they literally preferred being slowly tortured to death over spending another night in their cells. We're talking about underground chambers so horrific that dying from execution was considered a mercy, and conditions so brutal that disease-ridden dungeons made death row look like a luxury resort. What you're about to discover about medieval prison life will make every bad day you've ever had look like a 5-star vacation. These weren't just places of punishment, they were laboratories of human suffering designed to break both body and soul before you ever saw daylight again. Let's start with what would happen to you within the first hour of being thrown into a medieval dungeon. The moment you're dragged down those stone steps into a medieval prison, 3 things hit you immediately: the smell, the darkness, and the bone-chilling cold. We're not talking about a musty basement, we're talking about air so thick with human waste, rotting flesh and disease that you'll start gagging before your eyes adjust to the blackness. Medieval prisons were deliberately built in the worst possible locations: underground cellars, damp castle basements, or converted sewers. The infamous oubliettes, literally meaning forgotten places, were vertical shafts where prisoners were lowered through a hole in the ceiling and left to die. Some of these pits were so narrow you couldn't sit down, crouch, or even turn around. You'd spend days standing in your own filth until your legs gave out. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. There were no windows, no ventilation, and often no source of light except what filtered down from above. Contemporary accounts describe prisoners going blind from months in total darkness, their eyes literally unable to function when they were finally brought into sunlight. The floors were typically dirt or stone, always wet from groundwater seepage, human waste, and the decomposing bodies of previous inmates who hadn't survived their stay. You'd be walking on a carpet of rotting organic matter that squished under your feet and released new waves of putrid stench with every step. What happened next would determine whether you lived to see another sunrise. If you think prison food is bad today, medieval prisoners would have killed for a stale piece of bread and clean water. Most prisoners received no food at all from their captors. They were expected to pay for their own meals or rely on family members to bring them provisions. If you were poor, you starved. Period. Wealthy prisoners could buy decent food and even furniture for their cells, but commoners were left to beg through the bars or slowly waste away. Historical records show that many prisoners resorted to eating rats, insects, and even pieces of their own clothing just to have something in their stomachs. The food that was occasionally provided consisted of mouldy bread, rotten meat scraps, and water that was often contaminated with human waste. One medieval chronicler described prison meals as scraps fit only for dogs, and even the dogs would refuse them. Prisoners frequently died from food poisoning before their sentences were completed. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. Guards often withheld food as a form of torture. They would eat elaborate meals just outside the prison cells, describing every bite to the starving prisoners inside. Some guards would throw scraps on the floor and watch inmates fight over them like animals. The water situation was even worse than the food. Most prison water came from the same sources used for sewage, meaning every drink was a potential death sentence from dysentery, cholera, or typhoid fever. And that's when things turned from desperate to absolutely unthinkable. Medieval prisons weren't just overcrowded, they were biological weapons designed to spread every disease known to humanity. Dozens of prisoners were crammed into spaces meant for a few people, with no sanitation, no medical care, and no way to isolate the sick from the healthy. Contemporary accounts describe prison cells where inmates literally couldn't lie down because there wasn't enough floor space. People slept standing up, leaning against walls, or lying on top of each other in shifts. The smell of unwashed bodies mixed with open wounds, infected sores, and the constant presence of human waste created an atmosphere that would make modern hazmat teams refuse to enter. Disease spread like wildfire through these conditions. Tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery, and countless other infections swept through prison populations regularly, killing more prisoners than any execution method. Historical records from London's medieval prisons show mortality rates approaching 50%, meaning half of everyone who entered these facilities died before ever seeing trial. But the real horror wasn't just the common diseases. medieval prisons were breeding grounds for exotic infections that don't even exist anymore. Prisoners developed horrific skin conditions from constant contact with filth, respiratory diseases from breathing toxic air, and intestinal parasites from contaminated food and water. The most terrifying part, guards and prison officials understood that disease was often more effective than torture at breaking prisoners' spirits. Some facilities deliberately created conditions to maximize infection rates, viewing illness as a useful tool for maintaining control. What happened next shows just how completely medieval prisons destroyed human dignity. Physical suffering was just the beginning. Medieval prisons were specifically designed to break people mentally before they broke them physically. The combination of sensory deprivation, social isolation, and constant terror created psychological conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. Prisoners were often held in complete darkness for months or years. The human brain simply isn't designed to function without light, and extended darkness leads to hallucinations, depression, and complete mental breakdown. Medieval chroniclers describe prisoners who forgot how to speak human language, making only animal noises after months of isolation. The sounds inside these prisons were equally devastating. Constant moaning from the sick and dying, screams from torture chambers, and the endless dripping of water created a soundscape of despair that prevented sleep and drove inmates insane. Some prisoners report that the worst torture wasn't physical pain, it was never being able to escape the sounds of other people's suffering. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Guards deliberately played psychological games with prisoners. They would promise release dates that never came, describe elaborate meals they'd never receive, or tell them their families had forgotten about them. False hope was used as a weapon to maximize emotional damage. Many prisoners simply gave up the will to live. Historical accounts describe inmates who stopped eating, refused to speak, and essentially willed themselves to death rather than continue existing in these conditions. Medieval officials viewed this as a successful outcome. Death from despair saved them the trouble of executing prisoners. The real horror wasn't just what these prisons did to individuals, it's what they revealed about medieval society. If regular medieval prisons were hell, oubliettes were something beyond human imagination. These forgetting chambers were designed with one purpose: to make prisoners disappear from human memory while keeping them technically alive. An oubliette was typically a narrow vertical shaft, often only 3 or 4 feet wide, accessible only through a trap door in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered into these pits and simply abandoned. The dimensions were specifically calculated to prevent sitting, lying down, or resting in any comfortable position. You would spend days, weeks, or months standing in complete darkness until your body gave out. The most notorious oubliette was discovered at Leap Castle in Ireland when new owners found it filled with dozens of impaled skeletons. Historical accounts suggest that 3 cartloads of human remains were removed from this single pit. These weren't people who had died from starvation or disease, they had been deliberately thrown onto spikes at the bottom of the shaft. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. Oubliettes weren't used for ordinary criminals. They were reserved for people who had somehow become inconvenient to those in power. Political enemies, romantic rivals, or anyone who had seen something they shouldn't have could simply vanish into these pits without any legal process or public record. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical torture. Prisoners in oubliettes could often hear normal life continuing above them, conversations, footsteps, daily activities, while being completely cut off from human contact. They were literally buried alive while remaining technically living. What happened to these forgotten souls reveals the true brutality of medieval justice. For medieval prisoners, execution wasn't a punishment, it was often a relief. Historical records show that many inmates actually requested to be executed rather than continue living in prison conditions. Being hanged, beheaded, or even burned alive became preferable to the slow torture of medieval incarceration. Prison officials understood this psychological dynamic and used it to their advantage. They would offer quick death as a reward for confessions or cooperation, making prisoners compete for the privilege of execution. Some inmates confessed to crimes they hadn't committed just to escape the living hell of medieval dungeons. The most disturbing part was how efficiently these prisons destroyed human dignity. People who entered as functional human beings were reduced to barely recognizable creatures who had forgotten basic social behaviors, personal hygiene, and sometimes even their own names. Medieval chroniclers describe released prisoners who couldn't walk properly, had lost the ability to digest normal food, and were terrified of daylight. But not everyone was equal in these systems of suffering. Wealthy prisoners could buy their way to better conditions, private cells, and even servants to attend them. Meanwhile, poor criminals faced the full horror of medieval incarceration with no hope of relief. Class differences that existed in medieval society were amplified into matters of life and death inside prison walls. The contrast between rich and poor prisoners was so stark that wealthy inmates sometimes lived better in prison than poor people did in freedom, while commoners died horrible deaths just meters away in the same facility. These inequalities reveal something essential about medieval justice and about human nature itself. Medieval prisons weren't failures of the justice system, they were exactly what that system was designed to create. These institutions served multiple purposes. They eliminated inconvenient people, generated income for officials, and created such terrifying examples that they deterred others from challenging authority. Prison officials made their living by charging inmates for everything: food, bedding, candles, and even the privilege of being unchained. The worse conditions became, the more money desperate prisoners would pay for tiny improvements. Guards had economic incentives to maximize suffering because desperate people paid higher prices for basic necessities. This system created a feedback loop of horror. The more brutal conditions became, the more money flowed to prison officials, giving them motivation to make things even worse. Some guards built their entire careers around innovative methods of psychological and physical torture that would squeeze more money out of inmates. But here's what makes this legacy even more disturbing. Many of these medieval practices continued for centuries. European prisons in the 1700s and 1800s still operated on similar principles, with inmates paying for food, bedding, and basic human dignities, while officials profited from their misery. The medieval prison system proved that humans could systematically torture other humans for profit, entertainment, and social control. These weren't isolated incidents of cruelty. They were organized, institutionalized systems of suffering that operated for hundreds of years. The most chilling part is how easily ordinary people accepted these horrors as normal and necessary parts of justice. So here's the question that should haunt anyone who learns about medieval prisons. How did entire societies convince themselves that these systems of torture were acceptable forms of justice? The historical record is clear about what happened. Medieval prisons systematically destroyed human beings through starvation, disease, psychological torture, and deliberate neglect. These institutions operated for centuries with the full knowledge and support of religious leaders, government officials, and ordinary citizens who understood exactly what was happening inside prison walls. But the moral calculation is more complex than simple condemnation. Medieval societies operated under different assumptions about human rights, the purpose of punishment, and the role of suffering in justice. From their perspective, criminals had forfeited their claim to humane treatment and deserved whatever pain they experienced. These systems also served practical purposes. They eliminated people who couldn't be controlled through other means, generated revenue for local governments, and created powerful deterrents against crime and political opposition. In purely functional terms, medieval prisons accomplished their goals efficiently. The uncomfortable truth is that these systems worked exactly as intended. They removed inconvenient people from society, generated income for authorities, and created such terrifying examples that most people chose to obey rather than risk experiencing these horrors themselves. Medieval prisons reveal something essential about human nature. We're capable of creating and accepting systems of suffering that we would never want to experience ourselves. When we feel threatened, when we need scapegoats, or when we want to maintain social order, humans have repeatedly chosen torture over justice, suffering over rehabilitation, and cruelty over compassion. The people who designed, operated, and supported these systems weren't monsters. They were ordinary humans who convinced themselves that torture was necessary, profitable, and morally justified. What does that say about us, and what does it say about the systems we accept today? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Are we really that different from the people who created these medieval nightmares?